Meredith. We are happy to greet you in the frameworks of the project City as a Classroom. And today's talk is going to be about cities as a classroom, but from the perspective of a photographer and a photography. You have been professionally engaged in the documentary photography since long. So the first question is quite easy. Do you use digital camera or film camera, and why?
So right now I use a digital camera. Much of the work I did professionally was done with a film camera because I did a lot of work for National Geographic, and for a long time they didn't use digital, even for much longer. They didn't switch to film until much later than most other places, or switch to digital. You know, I prefer the digital cameras because they have a range, and you can control the colors, and you can do so much more with the manipulation after the post-processing. So I really don't use film anymore.
So you have mentioned that you've been working for a long time for National Geographic. So as a photographer for National Geographic, you had to implement some assignments in violent conflict cities, particularly in Latin America. So Meredith, how does it feel to be a photographer in environments as such?
I lived in Latin America for a long time, so I didn't just go there to work. And so I think, and the proposals and the projects I worked on were all of the work I did for Geographic, which was a while ago now. I did because I proposed it, because I was interested in it and I researched it. And I lived there I lived in Venezuela, Colombia, and then in Costa Rica for a total of 7 years. So for me, it wasn't just going to take pictures and then leaving. I had a relationship with each of those places. And, you know, I often, in complicated places, I often worked with someone else, and so I would have a person who was with me a lot of the time. Now, when I was doing a lot of the street photography, that wasn't necessarily the case, but I was, you know, it's good to have, especially in a place where you're not sure about the crime, the street crime. It's good to have another set of eyes, because when you start making pictures, you do get immersed in the world that you're thinking about, which isn't necessarily the world that's around you. You get so hyper-focused into something that sometimes I did get kind of lost in the process. But I often did work on the street, especially street photography. It's hard to work with somebody with you, you know. But for most other activities on those assignments, I would have somebody I was working with, a translator, or in Latin America, I didn't need a translator, but we call, they call them fixers, people who help introduce you to experts and politicians and those kinds of people.
So the third question would be, most of your photography work, not maybe most, but some of it, shows real life violence, conflict, suffering of people in different places of the world that many may not acknowledge or may not even know of, if not for media and photography. So why do you choose such a complex and psychologically demanding thing as, to photograph those cases?
It's different for each story that I did and each project that I did. I did a story in Medellin, Colombia for Geographic, where my intention was really to actually show how life would thrive despite the violence. So it wasn't an intention to necessarily introduce the place as violent, but to talk about how people overcame such difficult situations. And so in those cases, and Venezuela as well, the story I did for Venezuela for Geographic also, it was really attempting to explore this new president at the time, Chavez, and how his policies and what was going on in a deeper way than just to sort of show the violence. And I don't think I never intend to just show violence, because it's a news photo. If it's a photograph that's meant to depict a situation that happened, like a guerrilla massacre or something that happened, then that's a different project than a story that supposedly and hopefully explores like deeper kinds of life, like conditions in a place.
So Meredith, now certainly a person who does photography, he has a different logic compared to people that never did photography. Mm-hmm. And what can you tell about photography being a tool that would allow a person to explore cities in different ways and maybe see those things that regular people without a camera would, never see?
I think a lot of what happens when you put a camera in front of your face is it in some ways insulates you from what's going on around and it focuses you. But in other ways, it does sensitize you to certain things. And I think a lot of what especially working on the streets in cities, for me, the camera was a way to access places and people that I would never have access to, right? So I got to explore all different kinds of worlds and to get to know all different kinds of people with my camera. And I got to see the world through the different lenses that I chose to put on the camera. So there's that level that you're choosing, do I want to see the world more narrowly with a 50 or a telephoto lens, or do I want to see the world more in a wide angle view? And each time you walk with a camera, you usually have some kind of intention, whether it's the memory of when I was younger, the memory of an amazing street photographer who I had studied, whose work had left an imprint on me, and I wanted to find those kinds of images in the world, or whether it was an assignment where part of the story is to show these sort of clashes in the fabric of a city, or expand on like oasis of beauty. Like there was a photograph I did in Medellin of this really lovely park with water, and it was a kind of the image was a relief in the story. It allowed you to exhale and breathe, and it was a place where people found, solace and peace in the city. So based on the intention that you have when you're making the pictures, you find different things. So it's not really the camera that makes you see things differently, but it's the frame that you build with the camera, based on your intention.
So the next question is related to the book of yours, which is titled Theater of War. It has photographs and interviews of people who play live action scenes of conflict, and it speaks about war in media. I don't know if you have read any books of French thinker Jean Baudrillard, who's a very provocative thinker. And he wrote quite a lot about media, terrorism, and war as well. So what do you think about the role of media in representing or misrepresenting what is factually is happening in conflict zones?
Yeah, so I did read Baudrillard. I started that series. I read some things by Baudrillard. I started that series before I learned about Baudrillard, but I definitely was influenced by his thoughts as well. I think there's a real, I think it's a complicated question. And there's this whole question of truth, which you could spend a whole conference talking about. And so I think that the things that interest me as I get older have to do with how images are reverberated in different scenarios, and how, in fact, the way that we see the world is so influenced by these, thousands of images we consume every day. And I think Baudrillard talked a lot about how that the media, I think the first Iraq War was the beginning of a whole problematic around what people got to see and didn't get to see, and how war was framed. You could go back to the Vietnam War. There's a whole series of complications about how war is imaged and presented. And I don't know that there's any factual image of a war. I think that what's interesting and exciting about the time we live in is that everyone can make images about their experiences. So you saw a lot of what they call citizen journalism, bringing out images and looking at, the perspective of a conflict from the ground, from a protester. So there's all kinds of shifts that have happened. But I don't think there's any authentic or true representation of a war. It's just what the person who has the camera and the intention portrays.
You as a photographer, how do you think, what can any city teach a person or shape him in a certain way? Since you have been traveling a lot, you can tell the difference.
That's an interesting question. I've lived in cities most of my life, and big cities. So I lived in New York for a long time. I lived in Bogota for a long time. I think each city does shape. I think each city does shape us in very different ways. I remember living in Manhattan, and I lived downtown, and the buildings are so high and dark, and there's shadows. You don't see the open sky in Manhattan very often. And I always felt the energy. I lived down in lower Manhattan, and the energy kind of just shot down the boulevards, and people, the frenetic kind of crazy energy was mimicked in the way that the space was created, with high buildings and very limited view. So people were sort of hyper-focused, I think, in certain ways. And, Bogota was, the top of it was very high up, and there was this beautiful mountain that went up kind of above the city, and that mountain was always kind of present in a completely different way. The traffic in Bogota was horrific, so you'd spend hours in cars, but you would chat. And I learned to speak Spanish by talking with taxi drivers in Bogota. So, because I had a 2-hour drive, which was less than 5 miles. So each city shapes you and how you see the world completely. I don't think it's a question that it's sort of just paying attention to how that environment is creating your view, your worldview.